The morning of June 22, 1807, dawned hazy and warm over the waters off Norfolk, Virginia. Commodore James Barron stood on the deck of the USS Chesapeake, a 36-gun frigate newly refitted and preparing for a routine voyage to the Mediterranean. The ship was cluttered with stores and provisions, the gun carriages not yet fully installed, the powder horns largely unfilled. It was a vessel preparing for transit, not combat. Barron had no reason to expect otherwise. The United States was at peace with the world. The young republic, barely 3 decades removed from its revolutionary birth, busied itself with commerce and the expansion of its borders. The great powers of Europe, Britain and France, were locked in a death struggle that seemed, to most Americans, a distant affair. But, that morning, as the Chesapeake made her way past Cape Henry and into the open Atlantic, a British warship appeared on the horizon. HMS Leopard, a fourth-rate ship of the line commanded by Captain Salisbury Price Humphreys, was closing fast. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate, 5 years later, in a declaration of war. It would reveal the complex web of grievances, ambitions, and misconceptions that have shrouded the War of 1812 in myth ever since. And it would expose the uncomfortable truth that the real enemies of that conflict were far more numerous and varied than the simple narrative of American valor against British tyranny would suggest. Captain Humphreys brought the Leopard alongside the Chesapeake and sent Lieutenant John Meade aboard with a written demand from Vice Admiral Sir George Berkeley. The British wanted to search the American warship for deserters from the Royal Navy, specifically, for men who had fled British vessels in Chesapeake Bay and, according to British intelligence, enlisted aboard the American frigate. Commodore Barron refused. He told Lieutenant Meade that he was unaware of any deserters aboard his ship and that he would not permit a foreign power to search an American naval vessel. It was a matter of national sovereignty, he insisted, and he would not yield. Meade returned to the Leopard. Captain Humphreys hailed the Chesapeake with a speaking trumpet, demanding again that Barron submit to search. When the American Commodore refused a second time, Humphreys ordered a shot fired across the Chesapeake's bow. Then, the broadsides began. For 15 minutes, the Leopard poured fire into the unprepared American ship. The Chesapeake's guns remained silent, only a single shot was fired in response, when a desperate lieutenant used a coal from the galley fire to discharge one cannon. 21 cannonballs smashed into the American frigate's hull. Her mizzenmast fell. 3 of her crew were killed outright, 18 more, including Barron himself, lay wounded. Barron struck his colors. But Humphreys refused to accept the surrender. Instead, he sent a boarding party to search the Chesapeake and seized 4 men: Jenkin Radford, Daniel Martin, John Strachan, and William Ware. Only Radford was genuinely British. The other 3 were Americans who had previously served aboard British ships, claiming they had been pressed into service against their will. The Leopard departed. The crippled Chesapeake limped back to Norfolk. And, across the young American nation, a fury erupted. The Chesapeake affair laid bare a grievance that had festered since the end of the American Revolution, the practice of impressment. The Royal Navy, facing a manpower crisis in its endless war against Napoleon, claimed the right to board neutral ships and reclaim British subjects for service aboard its vessels. Between 1793 and 1812, the Royal Navy impressed an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 sailors from American ships, men who either were or claimed to be American citizens. The British position was straightforward, if infuriating to Americans. Britain did not recognize the concept of naturalized citizenship. Once a British subject, always a British subject. A man born in Liverpool who emigrated to Boston and obtained American citizenship papers remained, in British eyes, subject to His Majesty's service. And the Royal Navy needed men desperately. By 1812, the fleet had grown from 135 ships and 36,000 sailors to 584 ships requiring 114,000 men. Volunteers could not fill those ranks, so the press gangs roamed through British ports, certainly, but also across the decks of American merchant vessels. For Americans, impressment was a humiliation that struck at the very heart of their identity as an independent nation. Secretary of State James Madison, writing to the American minister in London, James Monroe, thundered that Britain treated the young republic as if the revolution had never occurred, as if Americans remained colonial subjects to be disposed of at the Crown's pleasure. Yet here was the first myth of the War of 1812 beginning to form, the myth of clear-cut enemies and innocent victims. The reality was considerably more tangled. Many of the sailors impressed from American ships were, in fact, British deserters. Life in the Royal Navy was brutal, harsh discipline, withheld wages, voyages that stretched for years. The American merchant marine offered higher pay, better conditions, and the freedom of neutral ports. British sailors deserted by the thousands, and many of them purchased forged citizenship documents for as little as $1. The British government pointed to these forgeries as evidence that American protests were, at best, exaggerated and, at worst, a cover for harboring deserters. Moreover, American naval officers engaged in the same practice. Captain Isaac Hull, who would later command the USS Constitution to glory against HMS Guerriere, impressed British sailors onto American warships. Captain William Bainbridge, before his appointment as a Navy lieutenant, seized an English sailor from a merchant vessel in retaliation for the impressment of one of his own crewmen. The records are fragmentary, but they suggest that impressment was not a uniquely British sin. It was a brutal necessity of the age, practiced by all maritime powers. None of this excused the attack on the Chesapeake. Captain Humphreys had fired upon a warship of a neutral nation, killing American sailors in peacetime. Vice Admiral Berkeley was recalled to London in disgrace. The British government eventually offered reparations and returned the surviving prisoners. Jenkin Ratford, the British deserter, was hanged from the yardarm of HMS Halifax on August 31, 1807. But the damage was done. The Chesapeake affair convinced many Americans that Britain viewed them with contempt, that the former mother country would never accept the United States as a sovereign equal. It convinced others that war was inevitable and, perhaps, desirable. In the years following the Chesapeake affair, President Thomas Jefferson sought to avoid war through economic coercion. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited American ships from trading with foreign ports, a self-inflicted wound meant to deprive Britain and France of American commerce. It failed spectacularly. American merchants suffered while British trade barely noticed. The embargo was repealed in 1809, replaced by a series of non-intercourse acts that proved equally ineffective. Meanwhile, on the western frontier, a different conflict was brewing, one that would become inextricably linked to the coming war with Britain and would reveal another set of real enemies in the 1812 narrative. Tecumseh was born in 1768 in a Shawnee village near present-day Xenia, Ohio. His father, Puckashinwau, was killed by Virginia militiamen when Tecumseh was 6 years old. His mother abandoned him and his siblings to follow part of the tribe to Missouri. Raised by his elder sister and trained in warfare by his brother Cheeseekau, Tecumseh grew into one of the most remarkable figures in American history, a warrior, orator, and visionary who dreamed of a united Native American confederacy stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, provided the spiritual foundation for this movement. In 1805, Tenskwatawa experienced a vision that called upon Native peoples to reject the ways of white Americans, their alcohol, their clothing, their tools, their treaties. A religious revival swept through the tribes of the Old Northwest, drawing warriors from the Shawnee, Iroquois, Miami, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and a dozen other nations to a new settlement at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. They called it Prophetstown. To American settlers and the government officials who served them, Prophetstown represented an intolerable threat. William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, had spent a decade negotiating treaties that stripped Native peoples of millions of acres. At the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809, Harrison acquired 3 million acres from tribes that, in many cases, had no legitimate claim to the land they were signing away. Tecumseh was outraged. He traveled to Vincennes twice to confront Harrison directly. At their second meeting, in August 1811, he allegedly told the governor that he would kill the chiefs who had signed the treaty. Harrison was impressed by Tecumseh's eloquence and charisma, but he was also alarmed. In a letter to Washington, he described Tecumseh as one of those uncommon geniuses who spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. Tecumseh informed Harrison that he was traveling south to recruit allies among the Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. He asked that Harrison take no action until his return. Harrison agreed to nothing. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was away, Harrison marched an army of approximately 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. He arrived on November 6 and made camp about 2 miles from the settlement. Tenskwatawa, lacking his brother's military experience but possessed of absolute faith in his spiritual powers, decided to attack. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on November 7, several hundred warriors launched a surprise assault on Harrison's encampment. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Harrison's men, sleeping fully clothed with loaded rifles beside them, fought off wave after wave of attacks. By dawn, the warriors had withdrawn. Harrison's forces suffered 62 dead and 126 wounded. Native casualties were estimated at around 150. The Battle of Tippecanoe was, at best, a tactical draw. But Harrison proclaimed it a great victory, and the American press amplified his claims. When his men entered the abandoned Prophetstown the next day and found British muskets and ammunition among the supplies, the story seemed complete. The British were arming the Indians, inciting them to murder American settlers. The enemies were clear. But were they? Here the myths of the War of 1812 begin to tangle in earnest. The British certainly maintained relationships with Native American tribes in the Great Lakes region. They traded with them, supplied them with goods, and hoped to use them as a buffer against American expansion into Canada. British agents encouraged Native resistance to American encroachment. Yet the documentary evidence suggests that British support for Tecumseh's Confederacy before the war was limited and cautious. In 1808, when British authorities in Canada first approached Tecumseh about forming an alliance, he refused. The British were not eager for a frontier war any more than the Americans were. Their attention was fixed on Napoleon, on the peninsula, on the survival of their empire against France. Tecumseh's movement arose from native grievances that predated British involvement and would have existed regardless of British policy. The treaties that stripped tribes of their lands, the settlers who encroached on native territory, the violence that accompanied the American frontier, these were American problems, created by American ambitions. The British were convenient scapegoats, but they were not the cause of native resistance. Moreover, the weapons found at Prophetstown were not evidence of some grand British conspiracy. Trade goods, including firearms, flowed through the Great Lakes region as a matter of commerce. Native peoples had been acquiring European weapons for 2 centuries. The presence of British muskets at Prophetstown proved nothing more than that trade networks functioned. Yet the myth of British Indian conspiracy proved irresistible. It allowed American politicians to externalize the blame for frontier violence, to cast themselves as victims rather than aggressors. It united the maritime grievances of Eastern merchants with the territorial ambitions of Western settlers under a single banner: Britain was the enemy. Britain must be punished. In November 1811, the 12th Congress convened in Washington. Among its new members was a group of young Democratic Republicans from the South and West who would earn themselves a nickname that would echo through history: the War Hawks. Henry Clay of Kentucky was their leader. Elected Speaker of the House at the age of 34, Clay was a brilliant orator with boundless ambition. He had grown up in the shadow of the Revolution, too young to have fought in it, burning with a desire to prove that his generation was worthy of its inheritance. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was his ally, intense, intellectual, convinced that American honor demanded satisfaction. Felix Grundy of Tennessee spoke for the frontier, where settlers lived in fear of native attacks and blamed the British for every tomahawk that fell. The War Hawks framed the coming conflict as a second war of independence. Britain had never truly accepted American sovereignty, they argued. The impressment of American sailors, the seizure of American ships, the incitement of Indian violence, all of it proved that the former mother country sought to reduce the United States to a vassal state. Only war could vindicate American honor. But the War Hawks' rhetoric obscured other motivations that were less noble and less easily defended. John Randolph of Virginia, one of the most vociferous opponents of war, saw through the patriotic speeches to the territorial ambitions beneath. In Congress, he mocked the War Hawks mercilessly: "We have heard but one word, like the whippoorwill's one monotonous tone: Canada. Canada. Canada." Randolph was exaggerating, but he was not entirely wrong. The War Hawks did want Canada, or at least, many of them did. They believed that the conquest of Canada would be, in Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase, a mere matter of marching. They imagined that French Canadians would welcome American liberators, that the scattered British garrisons would crumble before American arms, that the whole of North America would fall under the stars and stripes. Moreover, the war hawks represented constituencies with direct interests in territorial expansion. Kentucky settlers wanted to eliminate the native threat on their borders. Tennessee speculators had invested in lands that native peoples still occupied. Georgia planters cast covetous eyes on Spanish Florida, which sheltered runaway slaves and hostile Creek warriors. Britain was Spain's ally. War with Britain might yield Florida as a prize. These motives did not exclude genuine outrage at British insults or sincere concern for the rights of impressed sailors. Human motivations are rarely simple. But the war hawks' insistence that maritime grievances alone drove their demands for war was, at the very least, incomplete. They wanted land. They wanted glory. They wanted to finish the work that the Revolution had begun. On June 1, 1812, President James Madison sent his war message to Congress. He catalogued the familiar grievances: impressment, the seizure of American ships, the orders in council that restricted American trade with France, and, almost as an afterthought, British support for Native American resistance. It is difficult to account for the activity and combinations which have for some time been developing themselves among tribes in constant intercourse with British traders and garrisons, Madison wrote, without connecting their hostility with that influence. The House of Representatives voted for war on June 4, 79-49. The Senate followed on June 17, 19-13. It was the closest vote for war in American history, and the division fell along stark sectional lines. The South and West voted overwhelmingly for war. The Northeast, particularly the Federalist strongholds of New England, voted against it. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island would become centers of anti-war opposition, and their resistance would hamper the American war effort throughout the conflict. On June 18, 1812, Madison signed the Declaration of War. 2 days earlier, unbeknownst to anyone in Washington, the British government had suspended the orders in council, the trade restrictions that had been among the chief American grievances. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic. By the time word reached America, war had already begun. This accident of timing has led some historians to suggest that the War of 1812 was unnecessary, a tragic misunderstanding that might have been avoided with faster communication. But this interpretation misreads the situation. The suspension of the orders in council addressed only one of America's complaints. Impressment continued. British support for Native American resistance continued. The fundamental question of whether Britain would treat the United States as a sovereign equal remained unanswered. The war, once begun, would prove far more difficult than the war hawks had imagined, and far more revealing of who the real enemies truly were. Tecumseh learned of the American declaration of war while traveling in the South. He immediately turned northward and, with a party of warriors, made his way to Fort Malden at Amherstburg, on the Canadian side of the Detroit River. There he met Major General Isaac Brock, the British commander in Upper Canada. Brock recognized Tecumseh's importance instantly. The British position in Canada was precarious. They had fewer than 5,000 regular troops to defend a frontier stretching from the Atlantic to Lake Superior. Native warriors could multiply their strength enormously, but only if they were led by someone the tribes trusted. Tecumseh was that man. The two leaders, the Shawnee chief and the British general, formed an unlikely partnership. Brock was an aristocrat, educated, ambitious, skilled in the formal warfare of European armies. Tecumseh was a forest warrior who had fought the Americans for decades. Yet they respected each other deeply. Brock reportedly described Tecumseh as the Wellington of the Indians. Tecumseh, for his part, appreciated Brock's willingness to treat him as an equal and to make concrete promises about native lands after the war. Their first campaign together was a masterpiece. In August 1812, Brock and Tecumseh led a combined force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors against Fort Detroit, held by an American army under Brigadier General William Hull. Hull had invaded Canada with grandiose proclamations about liberating its people from British tyranny, but his campaign had gone nowhere. His supply lines were threatened, his troops were demoralized, his nerves were shattered by reports of native warriors gathering in the forests around him. Brock and Tecumseh exploited Hull's fears brilliantly. They allowed false messages suggesting a massive Indian army to fall into American hands. Tecumseh marched his warriors in circles through clearings visible from the fort, making his force appear larger than it was. Brock demanded Hull's surrender and warned that he could not control his native allies once the fighting began. On August 16, 1812, without firing a shot, Hull surrendered Detroit and 2,500 American soldiers to a British force roughly half that size. It was a humiliation that would haunt the American war effort and, eventually, cost Hull his command and nearly his life. He was court-martialed for cowardice and sentenced to death, though Madison commuted the sentence in consideration of Hull's Revolutionary War service. But the partnership between Brock and Tecumseh was short-lived. On October 13, 1812, at the Battle of Queenston Heights, Brock was killed leading a charge against American forces attempting to cross the Niagara River. His death removed the one British commander who had genuinely respected Tecumseh and understood the importance of native alliance. For Tecumseh, the war was never about Britain or America. It was about something far older and more fundamental, the survival of native peoples in the face of relentless American expansion. Throughout 1812 and 1813, Tecumseh fought alongside British forces in the Great Lakes region. He participated in the capture of Detroit. He led warriors against American positions along the Maumee River. At Fort Meigs, he reportedly saved the lives of American prisoners whom other warriors were about to execute, demonstrating the code of honor that distinguished him from many on both sides of the conflict. But his relationship with his British allies deteriorated steadily. After Brock's death, command in the Western Theater passed to Major General Henry Proctor, a cautious officer who lacked Brock's energy and courage. Tecumseh despised him. When American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry destroyed the British fleet on Lake Erie in September 1813, cutting off British supply lines, Proctor decided to retreat eastward toward Burlington Heights. Tecumseh was furious. He addressed Proctor directly, and his words, recorded by multiple witnesses, remain among the most powerful speeches in American history. "Father, listen to your children. You see them now all before you. The war before this, our British father gave the hatchet to his red children, when our old chiefs were alive. They are now dead. In that war, our father was thrown on his back by the Americans, and our father took them by the hand without our knowledge. We are afraid our father will do so again at this time." Proctor promised to make a stand somewhere along the Thames River. But he continued to retreat, his army disintegrating as it went. Supplies were abandoned. Discipline collapsed. By the time the British reached the vicinity of Moraviantown in early October 1813, they were a broken force. On October 5, 1813, American forces under William Henry Harrison caught up with the retreating British and native forces near the Thames River. Proctor attempted to form his 800 redcoats in a line across the road, with Tecumseh's 500 warriors positioned in the woods to the right. It was a desperate gamble against a force 3 times their size. The gamble failed. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson led 1,000 mounted Kentucky volunteers in a charge straight at the British line. The redcoats fired a single ragged volley, and then the line collapsed. Proctor fled the field, leaving his men to be captured or killed. Tecumseh and his warriors fought on. They drew the American horsemen into the swamp and fought hand-to-hand among the trees and mud. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and sometime during the battle, Tecumseh fell. No one knows exactly how Tecumseh died or who killed him. Richard Mentor Johnson claimed credit for the deed and would eventually ride that claim all the way to the vice presidency of the United States. His supporters chanted, "Rumsey Dumpsey, Rumsey Dumpsey, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh." But the truth remains uncertain. American soldiers stripped and scalped Tecumseh's body. Some reportedly peeled off skin as souvenirs. With Tecumseh's death, his Confederacy collapsed. The dream of a united native resistance to American expansion died in the mud beside the Thames River. Within 35 years, most native nations east of the Mississippi would be forcibly relocated to lands in the West. The real losers of the War of 1812 were not the British or the Americans, it was the native peoples who had fought for their survival and lost everything. While Tecumseh waged his desperate campaign in the Northwest, a different war was being fought on the high seas, and it was there that one of the most enduring myths of the conflict was born. On August 19, 1812, Captain Isaac Hull stood on the deck of the USS Constitution, the 44-gun frigate that had been built during the naval expansion of the 1790s. The Constitution was one of 6 original frigates authorized by Congress, constructed with massive white oak planking and live oak frames that made her stronger and heavier than comparable British vessels. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, lookouts spotted a sail on the horizon. It was HMS Guerriere, a 38-gun frigate commanded by Captain James Richard Decaurs. The Guerriere was one of the ships that had chased the Constitution a month earlier, and Decaurs was eager for a fight. The two ships closed on each other throughout the afternoon. Guerriere opened fire first, but at long range her shots fell short. Hull held his fire, ordering his crew to wait until they were almost alongside the enemy. When the Constitution finally unleashed her broadside, the effect was devastating. For 30 minutes, the two frigates pounded each other at close range. The Guerriere's mizzenmast fell, dragging the ship around and making her difficult to maneuver. Then, her foremast snapped, carrying the mainmast with it. The mighty British warship was reduced to a wallowing hulk. But what astonished both crews was what happened to the Constitution. British cannonballs, striking her hull at short range, bounced off the thick oak planking. One American sailor reportedly exclaimed, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron." The Constitution had earned her legendary nickname, Old Ironsides. Captain Decaurs, wounded in the back by a musket ball, had no choice but to surrender. When Lieutenant George Red of the Constitution rode over to receive his sword, Decaurs reportedly replied with dry British wit, "Well, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone, our mainmast is gone, and, upon the whole, you may say we have struck our flag." The Guerriere was too damaged to save. Hull ordered her burned, and she exploded the next morning when the flames reached her powder magazine. The Constitution returned to Boston in triumph. The victory sent shockwaves through both nations. For Americans, it was proof that their young navy could stand against the world's greatest maritime power. The Times of London captured British astonishment. Never before in the history of the world did an English frigate strike to an American. Yet the myth that began to form around Old Ironsides and her victories, the Constitution would go on to defeat 4 more British warships during the war, obscured more complicated truths. The American frigates were not ordinary warships. They had been designed from the beginning to outfight their European counterparts, carrying more guns, thicker hulls, and larger crews than frigates of comparable rating. The Constitution was, in effect, a small ship of the line pretending to be a frigate. Moreover, the American naval victories, though morale-boosting, had no strategic significance. The Royal Navy had 600 ships in service, the United States had fewer than 2 dozen. By 1813, the British had established an ironclad blockade of the American coast that strangled American commerce and rendered the American Navy increasingly irrelevant. The single-ship duels that thrilled American newspapers were pinpricks against an empire. The real war would be decided on land, and, there, the news was far less encouraging. The American invasions of Canada in 1812 and 1813 were disasters. The mere matter of marching that Jefferson had predicted turned into a series of humiliating defeats. American forces were poorly trained, poorly supplied, and poorly led. Militia units refused to cross into Canada, claiming that their enlistment did not require them to fight on foreign soil. Generals quarreled with each other and with the War Department. In the fall of 1812, an American attempt to invade Canada across the Niagara River ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Though Isaac Brock was killed in the fighting, his successor managed to defeat and capture the American force when militia reinforcements refused to cross the river. In the spring of 1813, American forces captured and burned York, present-day Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada, an act that would have consequences later but failed to follow up their victory. By the end of 1813, despite the death of Tecumseh and the American victory at the Battle of the Thames, the war in Canada had achieved nothing. Meanwhile, the British were winning the war in Europe. In the spring of 1814, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. The veterans of the Peninsular War, the finest infantry in the world, were now available for service in America. the British government decided to take the offensive. In August 1814, a British fleet carrying 4,500 troops under Major General Robert Ross sailed into Chesapeake Bay. Their target was the American capital. President James Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe were aware of the threat. They had made plans for evacuation. But they underestimated the speed of the British advance and overestimated the ability of American militia to stop it. On August 24, 1814, British and American forces clashed at Bladensburg, Maryland, a few miles northeast of Washington. The Battle of Bladensburg lasted 3 hours and ended in complete American defeat. The militia broke and ran, earning the engagement a nickname it would carry through history, the Bladensburg Races. As British troops marched into Washington, First Lady Dolly Madison remained at the White House, waiting for word from her husband, who was at the front. She had packed cabinet papers into trunks, loaded them onto a wagon, and sent them to safety. But there was one item she refused to leave behind: the full-length portrait of George Washington that hung in the dining room. The portrait was bolted to the wall. Dolly Madison ordered the frame broken and the canvas pulled free. She handed it to 2 men from New York, Jacob Barker and Robert G. L. DePaster, who carried it to safety. Then she fled, escaping Washington barely ahead of the British advance. That evening, British troops entered the abandoned city. They found a meal laid out in the White House, presumably prepared for the Madisons, who had expected to return and reportedly ate it before setting fire to the building. They burned the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and other government buildings. The flames lit the night sky. But the British occupation of Washington was brief. An accident with gunpowder barrels killed 30 British soldiers, and news arrived that a massive storm was approaching. On August 25, 1814, a tornado touched down in the burning city, one of the few documented tornadoes in Washington's history. The storm extinguished some of the fires and convinced General Ross that it was time to leave. The burning of Washington was a humiliation for the United States, but it was also a galvanizing moment. Rather than demoralizing the American public, it enraged them. Volunteers flooded to recruiting stations. The defense of Baltimore, the next British target, would be far more determined. September 13, 1814. The British fleet lay anchored in the Patapsco River, within striking distance of Fort McHenry, the star-shaped fortress that guarded the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. For 25 hours, British warships pounded the fort with shells and rockets, more than 1,500 rounds in all. Watching from an American truce ship 8 miles away was Francis Scott Key, a 35-year-old lawyer from Georgetown. Key had sailed to the British fleet to negotiate the release of Dr. William Beanes, a friend who had been captured by the British as they withdrew from Washington. The negotiations were successful, but Key and his companions were not permitted to return to shore until the bombardment was complete. They knew too much about British positions and intentions. All through the night, Key watched the battle unfold. The rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, these were not poetic exaggerations but literal descriptions of the British bombardment. When clouds of smoke obscured his view, he strained to see the American flag above the fort. If it still flew at dawn, Baltimore had survived. As the sky lightened on September 14, Key raised his spyglass and saw, through the clearing smoke, the enormous garrison flag, 15 stars and 15 stripes, measuring 42 feet by 30 feet, waving above Fort McHenry. The British were withdrawing. Baltimore had held. On the back of a letter, Key began to write, "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming." He completed the poem aboard the truce ship and had it published within days. Set to the tune of a popular British drinking song, the Anacreontic Song, it quickly spread across the country. Within weeks, newspapers from Georgia to New Hampshire had printed the verses. The song would eventually become the national anthem of the United States. But the Star-Spangled Banner was more than a patriotic song. It was a myth in the making, a narrative of American resilience and triumph that would shape how generations understood the War of 1812. The image of the flag, still flying at dawn after a night of bombardment, became a symbol of national endurance. It suggested that the war was a story of American valor prevailing against overwhelming odds. The truth was more complicated. The British bombardment of Fort McHenry failed not because of American courage, though there was courage aplenty, but because the British ships could not get close enough to the fort to achieve decisive results. The innovative bomb ships that lobbed shells into the fort from a distance could not batter down its walls. And the British commanders, shaken by the death of General Ross, who was killed by American snipers as the Baltimore campaign began, decided that the city was not worth the cost of taking it. While the battles raged at Washington and Baltimore, peace negotiations were already underway in the Belgian city of Ghent. American and British diplomats had been meeting since August 1814, trying to find a way out of a war that neither side could win decisively. The American delegation was led by John Quincy Adams, the brilliant son of the second president, supported by Albert Gallatin, James Bayard, Jonathan Russell, and Henry Clay, the same war hawk who had done so much to bring about the conflict. The British delegation was less distinguished but backed by the full power of the world's largest empire. Initial negotiations went badly. The British demanded an independent Native American buffer state covering much of the Old Northwest, a demand that would have surrendered territory the United States had held since the Revolutionary War. They also demanded American demilitarization of the Great Lakes and British access to the Mississippi River. The Americans rejected these terms. But they were negotiating from weakness. The burning of Washington had demonstrated American vulnerability. The Royal Navy's blockade was strangling American commerce. And, while the American delegation haggled at Ghent, British reinforcements were sailing toward the Gulf of Mexico, preparing an assault on New Orleans that might sever the entire western half of the country from the east. Yet the British position was also weaker than it appeared. The war with Napoleon had exhausted British finances and manpower. Taxpayers were weary of conflict. And the news from America, while generally favorable, was not uniformly good. The failure at Baltimore, the continuing resistance of American forces on the Canadian frontier, these suggested that conquering the United States would be far more costly than any gains could justify. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent. Its terms were, essentially, a return to the status quo before the war. No territory changed hands. The issues that had caused the conflict, impressment, trade restrictions, Native American alliances, were not even mentioned in the final document. It was, in diplomatic terms, a draw. Neither side had won, neither side had lost. The war that had consumed thousands of lives and millions of dollars ended with nothing changed. Or so it seemed. News of the peace treaty did not reach the United States until February 1815. In the meantime, the greatest battle of the war was fought and the greatest myth of all was born. Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans on December 1, 1814, charged with defending the city against the approaching British fleet. Jackson was a Tennessee lawyer and militia commander who had made his reputation fighting the Creek Indians in Alabama, breaking their power at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814. He was ruthless, charismatic, and utterly confident in his own abilities. The forces he gathered at New Orleans were as motley as any army in American history. There were regular soldiers and Tennessee volunteers, Kentucky frontiersmen and Louisiana militia. There were free black men organized into their own units, a decision that would have been unthinkable elsewhere in the slaveholding South. There were Choctaw warriors and Mississippi dragoons. And there were the Barratarian pirates, led by the notorious Jean Lafitte. Lafitte was a smuggler and privateer who operated out of Barrataria Bay, south of New Orleans. His main commerce was enslaved people, purchased cheaply in the Caribbean and sold at premium prices in Louisiana, where federal law prohibited the international slave trade. The British had approached Lafitte in September 1814, offering him $30,000 and a captain's commission in the Royal Navy if he would assist their attack on New Orleans. Lafitte refused and, instead, offered his services to the Americans. Governor William Claiborne initially rejected the proposal. The Louisiana legislature had branded Lafitte a criminal, but Jackson, desperate for men and supplies, reconsidered. The Barratarians brought with them something invaluable: 7,500 flints for muskets and rifles, and a supply of fine dry gunpowder far superior to anything the American forces possessed. On the morning of January 8, 1815, the British launched their assault. More than 5,000 veterans of the Napoleonic Wars advanced across the open fields of Chalmette Plantation toward Jackson's defensive line, a rampart of mud, cotton bales, and timber stretching from the Mississippi River to a cypress swamp. The British commander, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, was the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington and one of the most experienced officers in the British Army. His plan was straightforward: overwhelm the American defenses with massed infantry assault, the same tactics that had broken French armies across Spain and Portugal. But this was not Spain. The American defenders, protected behind their earthworks, included some of the finest marksmen in North America, frontiersmen who had grown up hunting squirrels and deer with rifles accurate to ranges that European smoothbore muskets could not match. And Jackson's artillery, much of it manned by Lafitte's pirates, was well positioned and expertly served. The result was slaughter. The British advanced in the pre-dawn darkness, their redcoats making them easy targets as the sun rose. American artillery and rifle fire tore into their ranks. Officers went down by the dozen. General Samuel Gibbs was mortally wounded. General Pakenham himself was killed, struck by grapeshot while trying to rally his men. In less than an hour, the battle was over. British casualties exceeded 2,000 men, including more than 700 killed. American casualties were fewer than 100, with only 13 dead. It was the most lopsided American victory of the war, indeed, one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The British withdrew, eventually abandoning their campaign against New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. The Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson a national hero, setting him on a path that would lead to the White House in 1828. It gave Americans a triumphant conclusion to a war that had otherwise been marked by defeat and disappointment. And it created a myth that would endure for generations, that the War of 1812 was an American victory, a second war of independence that confirmed the United States as a sovereign nation equal to the great powers of Europe. But the Battle of New Orleans was fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. The war was already over, the soldiers on both sides simply did not know it. In a strictly legal sense, the treaty did not take effect until both governments ratified it, and the United States Congress did not do so until February 16, 1815, after the battle. So the fighting was technically legitimate. But the victory at New Orleans changed nothing about the war's outcome. What, then, did the War of 1812 accomplish? Who were the real winners, and who were the real losers? And who, in the end, were the real enemies? For the United States, the war ended decades of British interference in American affairs. After 1815, the Royal Navy never again impressed American sailors. The orders in council, already suspended before the war, were never reimposed. Relations between the United States and Britain, while occasionally tense, never again approached the brink of war. By the middle of the 19th century, the two nations were close economic partners. By the 20th, they were the closest of allies. For Canada, the war confirmed a separate identity from the United States. The successful defense against American invasion became a founding myth of Canadian nationalism, a story of British regulars, Canadian militia, and native allies turning back the aggressive republic to the south. It was a myth as powerful in its way as the American myth of triumph at New Orleans. For Britain, the war was a sideshow to the great struggle against Napoleon, an annoying distraction that drained resources needed elsewhere. The peace terms reflected British priorities: end the fighting, preserve Canada, and get back to the business of dominating Europe. But the real losers were the native peoples who had fought alongside both sides. Tecumseh's dream of an independent native confederacy died with him at the Battle of the Thames. The Treaty of Ghent included provisions supposedly protecting native rights, but these were never enforced. After the war, American expansion accelerated. The treaties that stripped tribes of their lands proliferated. By the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act had authorized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of native people from their ancestral homes to lands west of the Mississippi, the Trail of Tears that remains one of the darkest chapters in American history. And so we return to the question that has framed this narrative: who were the real enemies of the War of 1812? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that there were many, and that they were often not who we have been taught to recognize. The British were enemies, certainly. They impressed American sailors, seized American ships, and supported native resistance to American expansion. Their attack on Washington and bombardment of Fort McHenry were acts of war that no nation could tolerate. But the British were also pursuing their own national interests in a global conflict against Napoleon. Their policies toward America were harsh, but they were not driven by contempt for American sovereignty so much as by the desperate necessities of a war for survival. When Napoleon was defeated and the necessity passed, the policies changed. The Native Americans were enemies in a different sense. They fought against American armies, killed American settlers, and allied with Britain against the United States. From the perspective of American frontiersmen, they were savage obstacles to civilization. But, from another perspective, the native peoples were defending their homelands against an aggressive invader. The treaties that stripped them of millions of acres were often negotiated with chiefs who had no authority to sign them, or coerced through bribery, threats, and alcohol. The settlers who flooded into native territory brought violence, disease, and dispossession. If anyone had the right to resist, surely it was the people whose ancestors had lived on the land for thousands of years. And, then, there were the enemies within. The War of 1812 was never a united national effort. New England Federalists opposed the war from the beginning, calling it Mr. Madison's War and refusing to support it financially or militarily. Some New England merchants continued to trade with the British throughout the conflict. In December 1814, Federalist delegates met at Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss their grievances, including, some suspected, the possibility of secession. The Hartford Convention did not go that far, but the suspicion of treason would destroy the Federalist Party as a national force. The war hawks, too, might be considered enemies of a sort, enemies of peace, enemies of caution, enemies of the diplomatic solutions that might have resolved American grievances without bloodshed. Their rhetoric of national honor and second independence obscured the territorial ambitions that drove much of their enthusiasm. They promised an easy victory in Canada and delivered 2 years of defeat and frustration. Even James Madison, the president who signed the Declaration of War, might bear some responsibility. He understood that the United States was militarily unprepared for conflict with Britain. He knew that the nation was deeply divided over the wisdom of war. Yet he yielded to the pressure of the war hawks and led the country into a conflict that came perilously close to disaster. The War of 1812 ended more than 2 centuries ago, yet its myths persist. The image of old Ironsides, the flag still flying at dawn, Jackson's riflemen mowing down British redcoats, these stories have become part of the American national identity, repeated in textbooks and commemorated in monuments. But myths, however inspiring, are not history. The real War of 1812 was messier, more ambiguous, and more tragic than the stories we tell ourselves. It was a war fought for complex reasons by imperfect people against enemies who were not always villains. It ended in a draw that settled none of the issues that had caused it, yet somehow transformed the relationship between the United States and Britain forever. The real enemies of the War of 1812 were not simply the British or the Native Americans or the political opponents of the Madison administration. The real enemies were the forces that make all wars, the failure of diplomacy, the seductions of national pride, the greed for land and power, and the willingness to sacrifice lives for abstract principles like honor and independence. Understanding who the real enemies were means understanding that history is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It means acknowledging the suffering of all sides, the impressed sailors, the burned cities, the slaughtered warriors, the displaced nations. It means recognizing that the triumphant narrative of American victory conceals a more complicated truth. The War of 1812 was, in the end, a war that nobody really won. And the myths we have built around it tell us more about ourselves, about what we want to believe about our past, than about what actually happened in those years of fire and blood between 1812 and 1815. Perhaps that is the most important lesson the War of 1812 has to teach us. History is not simply the past, it is the stories we tell about the past, shaped by our needs and desires, our fears and hopes. The real enemies of any war are never simple to identify, because wars are fought by human beings in all their complexity. And the greatest enemy of understanding is the myth that tells us otherwise.